late last October, Luke had headed out for a day of muzzleloading for whitetail deer out by the town of Marchand, Manitoba. Marchand's located about an hour southeast of Winnipeg. And to get to where Luke was going to be hunting that day, he had to drive down 15 miles of this old fire road. He said after driving down that fire road, he'd have to park his truck on the side of it and then walk 2 miles in on this little narrow, overgrown quad trail. So on this morning, he parked his truck, got out, and he said as soon as he got out, he felt off. He said he can't quite explain what this feeling was. He just felt off, and it just didn't feel right. He felt pretty nervous that morning. So as he was grabbing all his gear, he decided he was going to bring in his 12 gauge with him, which is normally something you cannot do in Manitoba during muzzleloading season. You could only carry a muzzleloader or a crossbow. You can't carry anything else. But Luke did not care on this particular morning. He grabbed his 12 gauge, he loaded it with double aught buck and slugs, grabbed his muzzleloader, and he made his way down this trail. He said after walking about a mile down this trail, it comes to a spot where the trail goes up this ridge. And he said right as he got to the top of that ridge, he said it was like he hit a wall. He said he just instantly had this feeling of dread that just came out of nowhere. So he stopped. He said he took a couple breaths, figured, maybe he's just on edge because of the feeling he had when he got out of his truck. So he just tried to calm himself down. After a few seconds, he tried to take a couple more steps forward. And he said as soon as he did that, that feeling of dread just amplified. He said he just had this feeling that if he kept going down this trail, something really bad was going to happen to him. So he said he just turned around and he started heading back towards the truck. After going a few hundred yards down the trail back to the truck, the trail forks off and goes north. Luke decided instead of going back to the truck, he was going to turn and take the trail north because he had another stand down that way as well. And he was out there to hunt, so he just wanted to hunt. So he was going to go sit in that stand, abandon going to that first one, and just hunt there for the day. So he said he made it all the way to his stand, no problem. He said he still felt pretty on edge the entire walk in, but it was nothing like he had experienced at the top of the ridge on that other trail. So he got to his stand, he climbed up, settled in, and his stand looks across this pine valley, and on the other side of that valley, on that other opposing ridge, is where his first stand is. That's the stand that he was initially going to go to. So he's sitting in a stand and he's looking across at the bush line on the other ridge, and he can't see anything because it's so dark, but he could just kind of make out the silhouettes of the tops of the trees. So he's sitting there, and he said about 20 minutes later he decided he was going to have a cigarette. It was still probably about an hour before sunup. So he pulled his cigarettes out of his pocket, and he said as soon as he went to light his lighter and that flame came up, as soon as that flame came up, all of a sudden there was this deep guttural scream from across the valley on the ridge where he was going to be hunting initially. When that scream happened, it startled him, and he ended up dropping his lighter to the ground. So now not only is he terrified because of the scream, because he's not sure what it was, but now he's dropped his lighter. He really wanted to have a cigarette, he said. He said so he went to look down, and he said when he looked down the stand, at the very bottom of the tree, he could see this dark, massive silhouette right at the base of the tree. So he said he's looking down at this thing, trying to figure out what it is, figuring it's probably a bear. So he had a tactical flashlight that he pulled out of his jacket, clicked it on and looked down, and he said as soon as that light came on, looking up at him was not a bear. He said looking up at him was this 10-foot tall Sasquatch just staring up at him. And he said as he's looking down with the light, looking up at the Sasquatch, he said this thing screams at him. And when it screamed, he could see its teeth. He said it's not like in a horror movie where they have jagged teeth. He said they were like big, flat teeth. But he screamed up at him, so he quickly grabs his 12 gauge and he's pointing it down at this thing because he doesn't know what it's going to do. He said as he's pointing his shotgun down at this thing, it turns and it just runs into the bushes. So he's still in a stand aiming down, just scared out of his mind. And he said all of a sudden there's another scream, but this time it came from the north, from to his left. So now he's freaking out because now he knows there's 3 of these things. There's one across this valley. There was the one underneath his stand, and now there's another one off to his left a couple hundred yards. So Luke said he just froze in place in his stand. He said he wasn't going to do anything until the sun came up. So he sat there for about another half an hour, and the sky was starting to turn gray at this point. And he's looking across that valley, and he sees 3 darker blobs on the other side of the valley along the tree line. So he's looking at them, and he's already thinking that, yeah, that those blobs are definitely these things that have been screaming at me. So he puts his 12 gauge beside him, and he grabs his muzzle loader. He lifts his muzzle loader up, and he said he cranked his power on a scope to maximum power, and he was looking through it, and he said he could make out the shapes, but he still couldn't really see anything. So he just kept moving his scope from one of these figures to the next and to the next. And he said he did that for the next 20 minutes until it was full on light. And he said as it got light, every time his scope would be on one of these Sasquatches, they would just glare right back at him. And that went on for another 15 minutes. And Luke had had enough now. Now it's full on light out. So he decided he was going to make a break for his truck. So he grabbed his shotgun, slung it over his one shoulder, slung his muzzleloader over the other shoulder, and climbed down his stand. As he was going down his tree on his climbing sticks, he turned and looked across the valley, and all 3 of these things instantly started running south, the direction that he was going to be having to go. So he hits the ground, he turns, and he just starts sprinting south down the trail back to where that fork is. When he got to the fork, he turned, and now he started running towards his truck. He said he didn't even make it about 50 yards, and all of a sudden he could hear something to his right in the bush. He could just hear the bushes just snapping and cracking, and he could hear something breathing real heavy. So he turns his head and looks, and one of these Sasquatches is running parallel to him about 15 yards into the bush. And he said this thing's just barreling through tree branches, and the tree branches are actually just blowing apart as it's ramming into these things. So he said he starts just running even faster than he ever thought he was even able to. And he could hear as well to his left, but slightly behind him, one of the other ones running along the side of the trail as well. And one behind him. He said he could hear these real heavy footfalls. And he said that last mile running to the road, he could hear all 3 of these things breathing real heavy. And every once in a while, they would scream or yip towards each other. He said it was like they were communicating. He said he felt like he was being herded in a specific direction, which just so happened to be in the direction of his truck. So Luke's running down the trail. When he breaks the wood line and gets up to his truck, all the noise and commotion in the woods stopped. So he runs around the side of his truck, gets up to the driver's door. He goes to unlock the door, and he looks, and all 3 of these Sasquatches are just staring right back at him from inside the bush line. So Luke opens his door, jumps in his truck, starts it, and he just floors it down this gravel road. He drove about a mile, and then he decided to actually turn around and go back, because he was going to try to get a picture of these things, hoping kind of that they were still on the side of the road. So he's driving down the road. He gets back to where he had his truck parked, and they're gone. So he rolls his window down. He just kind of sticks his head out the window to listen to see if he could hear anything at all. And all of a sudden, he could hear crashing coming through the woods directly towards him in his truck. So he's looking, and that 10-foot tall Sasquatch was running through the trees, pulling a big pine behind it. He said when this thing got to the edge of the bush line, hauling this big pine behind it, he said it stopped running, turned, and threw this pine tree at his truck. He said the pine slammed into the back driver's side of the box, shook his entire truck, and it actually blew out his back window. So Luke at this point now, he just pops it into drive, and he just floors it out of there. He didn't want to tell anybody exactly what happened to his truck because he didn't want anybody to think he was crazy. So he just told everybody that he was driving down a road. He ended up going off and ended up sideswiping a tree. Luke said, though, that this experience has shaken him. He says he will never go hunting again. He will never go in the bush again. His advice is if you're ever out in the woods, never be alone. He said always go with somebody, always be armed. And he said if you do come across one of these, just turn around and get out of there without them noticing you. He does not recommend pointing a firearm at them. He said he doesn't know if it was him pointing his muzzleloader at them when they were on the other side of that valley that made all three of them chase him out of there. But he figures that even if you would have tried to shoot one, he doesn't know how much damage it would actually do to them. He said they're just so big and so muscular that it would take a very large caliber to put one down. He said, so don't let a rifle or something give you a false sense of security with these things, because he really doesn't think it'll be that effective. In the early summer of 1994, right after Brad had graduated high school, he did not know what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. All of his buddies, they had their lives planned out. Some of them were going off to college, some were joining the army, and some were just going right into the workforce. But Brad, he had no idea what he wanted to do. So he thought a good way for him to kind of collect his thoughts was for him to go out to his dad's cabin up in the mountains of Washington State. Brad's dad was a Vietnam War vet, and shortly after returning from Vietnam, his dad had bought this property. His dad, when he got home, just wanted to escape society, just live off on his own for a while. So that's exactly what his dad had done. He bought this property. He actually lived there for a few years before he met Brad's mom. So Brad figured this was the perfect place. This is where he could go, be all alone, collect his thoughts, and try to figure out what he was going to do going forward. So early Saturday morning, loaded his Jeep with all of his gear, grabbed his chocolate lab, and they made the 6-hour drive out to the cabin. To get to the cabin, they had to take the highway that went up through the mountains, and at one point they actually had to turn off the highway onto this gravel road. They had to drive 6 miles down this gravel road that went up the side of a mountain, and then at one point there's a little tiny narrow drive that runs off this gravel road, and it runs for 3/4 of a mile, and that's where Brad's cabin was. So they turned, they went down that driveway, got to the cabin. Brad got out of the Jeep, went up to the front door, unlocked it, and now he had to open the cabin up. See, whenever they would leave, they would always put these bear spikes. So it's a board with a bunch of nails sticking up out of it. They would put that along by the doors and along the windows. That's just to keep the bears from trying to get into the cabin or a shed or any type of property, really. So Brad removed all those, he took boards off the windows, and opened the cabin up. That afternoon, Brad decided he was going to go for a hike with his dog. So him and his dog left the cabin, they walked down that narrow drive up to that main gravel road. When they got to the gravel road, they actually walked about a mile further down to where there was this old logging road that went up the side of the mountain. So they walked about 2 miles up this logging road, and it came to where the bush line started to thin out at a bit of a plateau. So when they got to the plateau, Brad saw a big log, and he decided that's the perfect place for me to sit for a while, have a snack, and just kind of relax and just stare out at the scenery. So Brad went, he sat on this log, and he was looking out at this valley in between these two mountains. And in the middle of this valley, there's a bit of a lake, and there's a little river that flows from that lake. So Brad just kind of sat there for about 20 minutes, just looking at the scenery in front of him, just relaxing and just enjoying being alone with his dog. After about 20 minutes, he decided, okay, let's start heading back to the cabin now. So they made their way back down that logging road. And when they got to that main gravel road, Brad looked off to his left, and he saw somebody walking towards him. So he just kind of stood there. He was looking, trying to figure out who this is walking towards him. So he's looking, and this figure's getting closer and closer, and he realizes it's a man, and he has a rifle slung over his shoulder, and he has a big revolver on his waist. So Brad's kind of looking, trying to figure out exactly who this guy is, and as the guy got closer, all of a sudden he realized, hey, it's actually our neighbor from about 1.5 miles down the road. So the neighbor came up, started talking to Brad. And the neighbor actually asked him if he had seen his dog. He had a golden retriever, and the neighbor said that he hadn't seen this dog for about 2 days now. He said his dog was acting a little skittish and it ran off into the woods and he hasn't seen it since. So Brad said, no, I haven't seen your dog. If I do see it though, I'll definitely let you know. I'll keep my eyes open. The neighbor then went on to tell Brad that he had been having a problem with this really big bear. He said this bear kept trying to get into his cabin. He said that this bear actually went into their chicken coop and took a bunch of chickens out of it. So that made Brad a little nervous, knowing that there's a big aggressive bear that's trying to get into cabins and it's stealing chickens. So he was feeling a little nervous because now he's still almost 2 miles from his cabin and he's unarmed. So Brad just kind of said to his neighbor, okay, I'll keep my eyes open, grabbed his dog, and he actually went down the road pretty quick, tried to get back to his cabin before darkness. When he got to his cabin, the first thing he did is he went into the master bedroom, he said, and in the master bedroom there's a closet. So he went into this closet, and on the left-hand side there's a loose board. So he grabbed the board, pulled the board down, and inside the wall was an old lever-action 30-30 that his dad had always stashed there just in case a bear came. So Brad pulled the 30-30 out, grabbed a box of shells, loaded it up, and he was just going to keep it close by just in case that bear that's been tormenting his neighbor tries to get into his cabin. Shortly after, he made dinner for himself and his dog, and then he spent the rest of the night, he just spent it reading. About 1 o'clock in the morning, he decided he was going to go to bed. So he went into the master bedroom, climbed into bed, he had his dog up on the bed with him, and he went to sleep. At 2 in the morning, he said he was awoken by the sound of his dog whimpering. He said his dog was whimpering and scratching underneath the bed. It was trying to get underneath the bed. And he said that's not what his dog normally behaved like. He said his dog was normally not scared of anything, so it really concerned him that his dog was so frantically trying to get under that bed. So he said he sat up in the bed, started tapping the bed to get his dog to jump up, and the dog would not come out from underneath the bed. He said then all of a sudden he heard from on the front porch, he also heard a loud creaking sound on the deck. So he said his first thought was, that bear that's been tormenting my neighbor is on my front porch and it's trying to come through my door. So he got up out of bed, grabbed the 30-30, and he walked across the cabin towards the front door. Right at the front door, there's a little window off to the left. So he looked through that window and he was looking towards the bush line, and you could see the side of his porch in front of him, and he saw nothing. So because he didn't see anything, he decided he was going to step outside onto the porch just to take a look around and see if he could see this bear. So he went to the door, opened it up, and he stepped out onto the porch. He said as soon as he stepped onto the porch, he was hit with this horrible smell. He said it just smelled like old rotten garbage. So now he's really thinking for sure this is that bear. Like has to be a big bear because this smell is horrible and whatever was on the porch sounded heavy. So he's looking around, and he decides, you know what? I'm just going to fire a shot up into the air and scare this bear away so I don't have to deal with it anymore tonight. So he lifts his rifle up, fires a shot up into the air, and as soon as he shot, he heard something really big and heavy running through the bush into the forest. He said for a second it sounded like it was running on 2 legs and not 4, but he figured it must have just been his imagination because he's just freaked out. It was just a bear, so he went back into the cabin, locked the front door, and he went back to the master bedroom. He lied down in bed again, and he said he was just falling asleep, and all of a sudden there was a loud thud right on the cottage, right behind his head, right where his head was. He said it shook the cabin, and some stuff on a little shelf above the bed actually ended up falling down on top of him. So he jumped up, grabbed the 30-30, and he ran towards the closet and put his back up against the wall. He said his dog went completely quiet. It was no longer whining or whimpering. It was just completely quiet. So he's standing there with the 30-30, and he's listening, and off to his right, on the side of the cabin, all of a sudden there's another loud thud. And he said the cottage shook again. So he said he was freaking out at this point because he figured for sure this is that big bear and it's trying to come in. So he's trying to think, like, did he clean up after dinner? Did he leave some food out? Or, like, what attracted this thing? So he's standing there for a few minutes and he decides, you know what? I'm going to fire another warning shot. So on the left hand side of the room, there's a small window, and he had that window open just to let some air into the room. So he walked over to the window, stuck the muzzle of the 30-30 out the window, and fired a shot into the ground. He said when he shot the ground, behind him on the right side of the cabin where that second thud had come from, there was just this absolute guttural roar. He said he could feel it resonating through his chest. And when it did that, he said his heart stopped. He said he put his back up against the wall and he was just clenching that 30-30 as tight as he could. He said for the remainder of the night until the dawn came, he said he was just up against the wall with the 30-30 and he was just staring towards that window intently. He figured something pokes his head by that window, he was just going to shoot it. And he didn't care what it was at this point. Now that the sun had come up a few hours later, he decided he was just going to leave. He wasn't even going to gather up his stuff. He just wanted to get out of there because this bear had come back twice now and he didn't want to deal with it, and he did not want to ever hear that roar again. So he went into the living room, he grabbed the keys for his Jeep and grabbed the leash for his dog. He went back into the master bedroom, reached under the bed, grabbed his dog's collar, and he had to force his dog out from underneath the bed. He forces his dog out, hooks up the leash, drags his dog through the cabin to the front door, opens the cabin door, goes outside, locks the front door, and heads straight to his Jeep. Puts his dog into the Jeep, and he decides at that point, he's like, what am I doing? Why am I going to leave because of a bear? So he decides he's going to go and just kind of do a sweep around the outside of the cabin just to see any sign of this bear. So he goes walking around the cabin, and when he got to the back of the cabin, which is where his head would have been when that first thud came, he said he looked down on the ground, and there were these two massive 17-inch long bare human-looking footprints in the dirt. So he's looking down at these footprints, and he starts to freak out because he's not sure exactly what he's looking at. So he lifts his head, and out of the corner of his eye, he sees something moving through the trees. So he quickly snaps his attention that direction, and he sees this 9 to 10 foot tall creature go behind this big pine tree. So he's staring at this pine tree, and he says he all of a sudden he sees a hand and part of an arm come around the one side, and a head pokes around the other side. And he says he sees this thing's face, and he freaks out. He turns and he just runs right back to his Jeep. Gets in his Jeep, and he just takes off. When he got back to his house, his parents asked him, like, why are you back already? You were going to be gone for a week. You left yesterday, and now you're home now. And he said, oh, there was a big bear that was trying to get into the cabin. So his dad asked him, like, where's all your stuff, and why do you have my rifle? So Brad told his dad, like, I just got out of there really quick. So Brad's dad was super mad at him now, because now he didn't lock up this cabin. So now Brad's dad's going to have to go out there and do it. So Brad's dad went out to the cabin, and he came back later in the day. It was about 12, 13 hours later, because it's a 6-hour drive out there. When his dad got home, he actually called Brad into the backyard. So Brad went out to the backyard to talk to his dad, and his dad told him, hey, look, I know this wasn't a bear. Like, you need to come clean. What did you see? So Brad came clean with his dad and told him exactly what he had saw and what he'd experienced. And Brad's dad told him that back in the early 70s, he had a couple of his non-buddies out there for a weekend. They just wanted to spend the weekend together because one of their buddies was going through a bit of a hard time. And one night, while they were inside the cabin, they were playing cards and drinking, they went through almost the same thing. There was a loud thud on the side of the cabin, and when his one buddy went outside, he came face to face with this thing. So Brad's dad told him that he knows that these things are out by their cabin, and he never wanted to tell his wife or his kids about them because he didn't want to ruin the wilderness for them. Brad's dad told him not to mention it to anybody. He said if he mentioned it to anybody, they're just going to think he's crazy, and if he told the authorities, that they would just lock him up and throw away the key. Brad said that he's only ever told his wife, his best friend, and his dad about this. Now, Brad's advice is if you ever go in the woods, he said, don't go alone. And he said, it doesn't matter if you're staying in a tent, you're staying in a cabin. He said, just don't go alone, don't go unarmed. He also said, though, that don't fire a warning shot at these things. He said, if you fire a warning shot, it just seems to trigger their aggressiveness. He figures when that Sasquatch was first on the front porch, he figures it was just curious. And when he fired that shot up into the air when he was on the porch, that it angered this thing. And at that point, that Sasquatch saw him as a threat, and that's why it assaulted his cabin. So again, his advice is just don't shoot at them. Just never go alone anywhere. Just always be cautious. Today's encounter comes from Tim, and it happened in late November of 1994 out in northeastern Ontario. Tim was a 20-year veteran logger at this point, and he was living in Timmins. However, where he was working was actually an hour and a half from his home. Now, Tim's job with his company, he wasn't a typical logger. He wasn't going out of the bush, cutting down trees, loading them on a truck, and sending them off to a mill. He actually drove this big piece of cutting equipment, and his job was to actually cut new roads into new cut sites for his company. On the morning of his encounter, he woke up just like any other day, went out to his company truck, and he made the hour and a half long drive to the haul road where he would always park his rig at the end of the day. So when he got to his rig, he pulled his truck over, got out, got in the rig, and then he had to make an 8-mile trek down this fresh cut that he had been working on for a few weeks. Tim said to get to where he had finished off the day before, he said it took him an hour to drive in there with his rig. So once he got to the end of the road, he spent the whole day just making that road just a little bit longer. And at the end of the day, when everybody was going home, Tim decided he was going to work overtime. Christmas was coming up in a month, and he could really use the extra money, so he figured, why not? I'm just going to stay out here, put in some more hours, and make some more money. Now, his company, even though safety measures aren't what they're like today, his company still normally did not allow employees to work alone in the woods by themselves. However, because Tim had been with them for 20 years, they kind of let things slide with him a little bit, so it was all right for him to stay out there. So Tim stayed out and continued cutting all the way till 11 o'clock. Once 11 o'clock came around, he figured, okay, that's it for me for tonight, and he turned his rig around and he started making his way home. He started going down that trail he had been working on. He made it about a mile and he got to a real low spot, which was just this giant slough. And as he was crossing it, his unit actually broke through the very thin layer of ice, and he said all the mud and weeds just kind of tangled in and caked into his tracks, and his unit would not budge. He spent about 20 minutes trying to get unstuck, but it was absolutely useless. His machine was not going anywhere. So now he was faced with one of two options. He was either going to have to walk out that night, or he would have to spend the night in the rig and then walk out in the morning. There was no crew coming the next day. It was a day off for the company, so his only options were to walk out that night or walk out that next morning. There was going to be nobody coming that he could hitch a ride with back to his truck. So Tim sat in the unit for a little bit, kind of weighing his two options, and he decided, you know what? I've been a hunter and a logger pretty much all of my life. I grew up in the woods. You know, a 7-mile walk in the dark, that's no big deal. I'll be fine. I'm just going to walk out tonight. I just want to go home. So Tim turned his machine off, climbed out of it, and he started walking down that cut. So he walked for about 45 minutes down this trail, and at one point in front of him, about 100 yards down, he noticed this real dark silhouette right on the left-hand side of the trail. He said it was fairly low to the ground, so that his first thought was, this is a bear. Now, typically bears would be hibernating at this time of year, but it's not too uncommon for logging operations like this to actually make a trail right past a bear den and actually wake them up from hibernation for a bit. So that's exactly what Tim was thinking. He thought for sure this is a bear in front of him. So he stopped because he didn't want to get closer to this thing and risk having it attack him. So he stopped and he just let out a soft, "Hey bear." And as soon as he did that, this thing stood up on two legs. As soon as that happened, his mind switched from this is a bear to this is one of my coworkers. They're just playing a prank on me. So he stood there quiet for a second, just looking at the figure in front of him. And all of a sudden, this thing took a step up and out onto the trail. It had turned out that it was actually standing in a divot on the left-hand side. And when it stepped out, it rose to a height of 10 feet tall. Now, Tim didn't get a good description of this creature in front of him just because it was so dark and all he could see was a silhouette. The only light he had was from the moon and the reflection off the snow because he did not have a flashlight on him. But he was looking just at the sheer size of this creature in front of him. And so he kind of took a step back, and right as he stepped back, this creature in front of him let out an earth-shattering scream. He said he just felt it vibrate right through his chest. And that was enough for him. He turned and he just started running back to his rig. He had ran for about 2 minutes and he heard that same scream come from his left of the trail and from the right. On the left it screamed, and 2 seconds later from the right it screamed. So he's freaking out even more now because now he figures there's 3 of these things chasing him down this trail. So he ran all the way back to his rig. And when he got to the rig, he climbed up, locked it, and he just lied on the floor. He said he was absolutely terrified. He said he was shaking uncontrollably. His heart was beating a million beats a minute. And he said he could not focus on anything aside from just lying on the floor and remaining as quiet as possible. He did not know if these creatures had followed him back or not, but he did not want to make a sound. After about 20 minutes and nothing happened, he thought for now at least he was safe. So he decided he was going to climb up and just kind of peek his head out and just kind of look around to see if he could see anything. As soon as he started to climb up off the ground, he heard a loud thump on the left-hand side of his rig, and his rig actually shook. So he ducked back down to the floor, and then there was another thud, and his whole rig shook from the right. So he was lying on the floor now, and he was just absolutely freaking out because now he knows that for sure 2 of these things have followed him back to the rig. So while he's on the ground, he looks up and he actually notices his CB radio hanging there. So he reaches up, grabs the CB, and he called dispatch. He told dispatch that he was stuck and he needed them to send help right away. He did not tell them about these creatures that were attacking his rig. He just said that he was stuck and he just needed help as soon as possible. Dispatch came back and said that they were sending help and that help would be there in about an hour and a half. So now Tim's even more freaked out because now he knows he's going to be alone with these creatures for at least an hour and a half now. So he just continued to lie on the floor and he didn't move. He said for about an hour, nothing happened. He said so he was kind of starting to feel a little bit better because now he knew it's only a half hour till help comes and nothing's happened for an hour now. So he decides he's going to get up and just peek his head around to see if he sees anything. He said as soon as he went to lift his head up, all of a sudden from directly in front of him, he heard that scream again. There was one scream and then another scream and then a third scream in rapid succession. So he just dropped back down to the floor of the rig and he thought for sure he was going to die. He said he thought he was going to have a heart attack at this point. He said he's never felt like that in his life. He said he didn't even know his heart could beat that fast. So he's lying on the floor and about 20 minutes later his CB crackled to life. So he grabbed it and it was actually a guy he knew named John who was coming to pick him up. John came over the CB and actually asked him if there was another crew working. He said because there were a bunch of trees down about a half a mile from his location. Now when Tim had been running down the trail, there was no trees down on this trail at all. So now Tim's freaking out because now he knows he's going to have to get to John's truck on foot. So he took the CB and he asked John if John was armed. John came back saying that he had a 12 gauge with him. So Tim told John, okay, bring it please. And John asked, hey, why? What's going on? And Tim actually ended up telling him all about what was going on. He said, you know what? I think I'm being attacked by 3 Sasquatch right now. And he thought for sure John was just going to laugh and be like, yeah, whatever, just get over here already. But John actually came back over the radio and said, you know what? I believe you. I'm coming to get you. About 10 minutes later, Tim heard a knocking on the window. And he heard John's voice say, hey, Tim, it's me, open up. So Tim climbed up off the floor, unlocked the door, open it, and he was so thankful to see John standing there. Just to see him alone was just an absolute blessing for him at this point, especially to see him armed. Just gave him a little bit of a sense of relief. So Tim climbed out of the rig, and the two men, they made their way back to the truck. The entire time John had his shotgun up at the ready, and he was just scanning left or right down this trail. They got to the truck, and they just hightailed it all the way back to the haul road. When they got to the haul road and Tim went to get out of the truck, John reached over and grabbed his arm, and John actually told Tim, you know what? I've seen these things before. I saw one a few years ago about 15 miles from here. And John told him that after he had seen one of these, he actually told his supervisor. And when he told his supervisor said, you didn't see anything, and if you say you saw anything, you're fired. So John told Tim, you know what? Leave this between us. If anybody asks, we'll just tell them that there was a pack of wolves and, I had to come get you, and that's it. Tim actually ended up quitting logging shortly thereafter. Now, he hasn't told too many people about this. He's told his wife, his kids, and his grandkids, but that's pretty much about it. He never did tell his supervisor just because of what John told him about his experience. John and Tim, they're still friends today. They still talk about each other's encounters to each other just to kind of help each other work through what they went through. Tim's a French Canadian, and he's very straight to the point. So when I asked him if he had any advice whatsoever to give, his only advice was, don't get stuck. Today's encounter comes from Eric, and it happened in the fall of 2020 while he was out solo blacktail deer hunting in the remote wilderness of the Chilcotin Mountains of British Columbia. Eric had grown up hunting, and he had actually hunted this particular location several times growing up. However, it had been about 20 years since he had actually been out there. This area is incredibly remote. In order to get to where he was going, he had to drive 20 miles down a haul road, park his truck, and then walk for a full half a day into the mountains to get to where he would set up camp. That would be enough to deter most people from going off on a solo trek like this by themselves, but not Eric. See, Eric was actually a 15-year veteran of the Canadian Forces, and he served in a unit that was called the 3rd Royal Canadian Regiment. So he was very confident with his skill set and very confident in the woods. So it was no problem for him to go off and do this by himself. So that's exactly what he did. He drove down that haul road, he parked his truck, grabbed his kit, and started making his way into the mountains to go set up camp. He had his rifle with him, which was a .300 Winchester short mag, a map, a compass, and a GPS. So he was very confident that he would be able to safely find where he was set up camp, the same area where him and his dad would set up camp when he was younger. So he walked through the mountains, and he eventually came to a valley, and there's a little river that goes through this valley, and that's exactly where he set up his camp, right up along that water. So he set up his camp, got a fire going, ate some beans and sausages, kind of went through all of his kit just to make sure everything was in order for the next day. Once it got dark, he crawled into his tent, set an alarm, and he went off to sleep. He woke up the next morning at 3 a.m., got up, he ate a quick breakfast, packed his day pack with a couple of rations for the day, and then he started walking along that river. And he had to walk for about 2 hours, and eventually that little valley started to widen up, and there was another valley that actually connected to that valley that he was camping in. And he knew that there was a plateau about 200-300 feet up the side of this mountain. And that's where he wanted to go set up for the morning. He wanted to go up to this plateau so that he could just kind of glass the area just to see what kind of deer movements there were. So he turned and he started making his way up the side of this mountain up to this plateau. When he got up there, he set up his spotting scope and he just waited for dawn to break. Once dawn broke, he just spent the entire morning just glassing those two valleys. He had seen so many deer move across those river basins that around noon he decided he was going to climb down the side of the mountain and he was going to go set up right where those two rivers met, because he figured for sure that was the best spot where he would have the best luck of getting a deer that night. So that's exactly what he did. He set up right where the two rivers met and he sat there all the way until dark. Once it got dark, he pulled out his GPS and he started making his way back to camp. Now, he had a 2-hour walk to get back to camp, just like he had a 2-hour walk to get into where he was hunting in the morning. So he made his way along that river, and when he was about 50 yards away from camp, he noticed that his food bag that he had hung up that morning after breakfast was gone. The rope was gone, everything was just gone. So he instantly thought, great, a bear's come and stolen my food. So he started to get a little nervous about what he was going to find when he got back to his camp. Sure enough, when he got to his campsite, it was completely ransacked. His tent was ripped to shreds, his kit was all over the ground, all over the campsite, and his stove was completely crushed. So his first thought was, this was a big grizzly. So right away, he went around his camp, just kind of taking stock of what was damaged, what was missing, and just kind of trying to find any sign of a bear, just to see the size of its print, just so he knew what he was up against. He didn't end up finding any bear prints around camp though, so he just kind of went around, gathered up all of his kit, and then he stood there and just stared at the remnants of his tent. He was super mad at this point because he knew he can't sleep in this tent, he has no food, so he knows that he has to cut his trip short. And he also knew that, you know what, it's way too dangerous to make my way back to the truck tonight. So he knew he was going to have to stay there that night, but now he needed shelter. Luckily though, he had a tarp and he had some rope with him, and he was actually able to make himself a lean-to, and he built it right beside his fire ring. Once he had his lean-to set up, he decided he was going to go around camp and just gather up as much firewood as possible, just so that he could keep that fire burning big and bright all night long to try to keep away that bear. Once he had gathered all of his firewood and he thought it would be enough for the night, he had a quick emergency ration from his day pack, and then he crawled into his sleeping bag beside the lead-to. Shortly after lying down, he heard something really big moving directly towards him from in the woods. He instantly thought for sure it had to have been that bear. So he grabbed his rifle and he just lied completely motionless inside of his lean-to, just listening to this thing move closer and closer towards him. When it got about 15 yards from him, it stopped moving. As soon as it stopped, he just yelled, "Hey, get out of here," just in hopes that if it was this bear, that bear would turn around and it would just run back the way it came. However, it didn't turn around and it didn't run back the way it came. Instead, it answered back with this low, deep, guttural huff. And he said as soon as he heard that huff, he knew he was not dealing with a bear. He had heard bears huff before, and he said this sound was completely different. He said it was way too deep and way too guttural, and he had never heard a grizzly sound like that before. So it put him into a little bit of a panic mode, and he jumped out of his lean-to and he got his rifle up, and he was just kind of scanning all around camp trying to figure out exactly what had been moving towards him. At first he couldn't see anything, and then from behind the lean-to, about 9.5 feet off the ground, he noticed there were these two red eyes just staring right back at him. So he quickly got his rifle trained right in the direction of those eyes, and as soon as he did that, those eyes ducked in behind this tree that it was peering around the corner of. So when it did that, he instantly kind of thought, is this thing just hiding, or is it going to circle around and is it going to flank me and try to get me? So he had his rifle up again and he just kept kind of looking all around camp, just trying to pay attention to what was going on to see if this thing for sure was behind this tree still, or if it had been circling around trying to get up from behind him. He said as he was looking around, those eyes that ducked in behind the tree all of a sudden peered around from the other side of the tree. So he moved his rifle quickly towards the eyes, and again, as soon as he did that, they ducked back in behind the tree. He said that went on for a couple of minutes. He said it would look out one side, he would get his rifle on it, and it would duck back behind the tree. Then it would peer around the other side, he'd get his rifle on it, it would duck back again. After a few minutes of dealing with that, he decided, this is enough, I just want to get the hell out of here. So he took his rifle and he just fired a shot into the ground. He hoped that that would make this thing take off. When he fired that shot into the ground, this thing let out a growl that Eric said he could just feel it resonate through his chest. And as soon as it growled, it peeked back around from behind that tree again. And he said this time the eyes looked completely different. He said the first time the eyes kind of looked like they were more curious, but this time he said they looked like they were just full of anger and hate towards him. So he turned and he just started running right back in the direction of his truck. Now, that was a half a day walk from his truck to where he set up camp, so he ran all night. He said every time he stopped to take a break just to kind of catch his breath, this thing would growl at him. He said it stayed about 30 yards behind him all night. Once it got lighter and he kind of knew where he knew he wasn't that far from his truck anymore. He started to feel a little bit of relief because he knew pretty soon he would be at his truck. When he got to the haul road and his truck came into sight, he just used every last ounce of strength just to sprint directly to his truck. When he got to his truck, he had to turn and look back towards that bush line that he had just come out of. And when he did that, he noticed there was actually two of these Sasquatch staring at him. So all night, he was not chased out of the woods by one. He had two of these things chasing him all the way back to his truck. Eric has not told anybody about that. He said he just doesn't like to talk about it. He said he's always been afraid that if he says anything about it, people are just going to think he's nuts. I asked him if he had any advice, and his advice is never go into the mountains alone. He said always go with at least one other person, and just if you do come across one of these things, he said don't shoot the ground. He said that just seemed to really anger it. He said before he shot, as he said, the eyes looked like they were more curious. He only fired a shot just out of fear, but he does not recommend doing that. He figures if he wouldn't have shot, this thing might have eventually left, but him shooting the ground just triggered this angry response from it. Well, that's it for today's encounter. I just want to take a second just to thank everybody for your support. It's been awesome, and I just want to say thank you for coming back, and I'll see you next time.